Our speakers to start, Anne-Emanuelle Birn for the affirmative will start first. It's a strictly no PowerPoint debate, so a bit unique, at least from my perspective, which is really welcome. And she'll start with a 6-minute opening statement that global health can be achieved.
In 2011, Costa Ricans lived on average to the age of 79, identical to the life expectancy in the United States. How we explain this seeming anomaly bears significantly on whether global health can be achieved. Now, we have jointly decided on a definition of achieving global health as reaching levels of life expectancy equivalent or similar to those in Japan or Sweden, while also achieving reductions in social inequalities in life expectancy akin to the same countries. So just to get you started, Japan's life expectancy is 83, Sweden's is 82 years. So from my perspective, there's no better way to address this issue than historically. And unlike many in global health, I'm not an advocate of magic bullets, technical quick fixes in the absence of large socio-political change. So what I'm going to argue is that the data will bear me out, that not only have Japan and Sweden achieved this global health success, but low and middle income countries can do the same. And I'm going to start with a bit of a background on how Japan and Sweden got where they are, and then move on to several low and middle income countries. So, to begin, Sweden in the late 19th century was an immiserated place. Peasants in the countryside barely lived beyond 30 years. They were recruited as laborers into crowded cities, toiling dangerous, long hours in factories, and starting at a very young age. However, by 1950, that 30-year life expectancy had more than doubled to 71 years. How did they do it? Well, on one level, there was a democratization of the country. So voting came into power, the struggle for the right to vote in 1921, a breakthrough of parliamentarianism in 1917, and from 32 to 76, the country was under social democratic rule when many welfare state policies were designed and implemented. So unions were a powerful lever, and you had a combination of democracy, education of the public, social justice, and the Gini coefficient, that is the inequality coefficient, the lower the better, started out in 1925 at 0.4, went all the way down to 0.2 in 1980, and now is up to about 0.23. So an enormous success story based on this socio-political change with public health as part of it, but much of the change actually took place before the development of the modern medical armamentarium after the Second World War. Japan, at the end of World War II, was absolutely devastated. There had been 3 million deaths, 300,000 died just from the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The United States took over under Marshall a kind of an occupation of the under MacArthur, an occupation of Japanese society. And there were 3 elements of the U.S. occupation of Japan: demilitarization, democratization, and decentralization of wealth. So demilitarization led to the disbanding entirely and the renunciation constitutionally of war as part of this country's sovereign rights. Democratization led to free universal education, the right of workers to organize and bargain collectively, and a reduction in income and social inequalities. And decentralization of wealth sought to bring about a middle class. MacArthur enforced the breakup of business conglomerates, and, get this, a maximum wage was legislated, not a minimum. Okay, so historians argue that Japan underwent the most successful land reform in world history, but also the highest and fastest life expectancy growth. So from 1946 to 1951, male life expectancy went from 43 to 61 years. Extraordinary. But what about low and middle income countries? In Costa Rica, we have a similar demilitarization in 1948, when after a brutal civil war, Costa Rica's military was disbanded. Now, Costa Rica's economy had been traditionally based on the export of primary products, bananas and coffee, like other low-income economies. It was dependent on fluctuating commodity prices set by international markets. But with its peace dividend, it invested heavily in nutrition, education, health, and the environment. And so despite economic crises later on in the 1980s, Costa Rica's welfare state, built out of the ruins of this terrible civil war, led it to a very comprehensive educational, social services, public health system, and today it's even becoming carbon neutral. We could follow on with my 3 other cases, Cuba, Sri Lanka, Uruguay, but it sounds like I have just about enough time now. What I'd just like to re-emphasize is that low and middle income countries can achieve global health just as high income countries can.
Okay, so I feel like a bit like the wicked fairy at Snow White's christening. I was afraid you guys were going to boo when I started speaking, but maybe you're saving that for later. So we agreed on a definition of health. And what I would like to argue is that although I'm a great optimist about global health, I am also a realist. I realize the limits that we face. So I would like to start by thinking about the determinants of health. Okay, I'm sure you've talked about this in other classes. So there are proximate determinants of health, and those are things that you and I, as health professionals or trained in the health area, can do something about and know a lot about. The health system, health promotion, and inserting health-related public policies are all things that we have expertise in. But there are also underlying determinants of health, and there's a whole literature on the social determinants of health. And these are very important factors that affect health that are not within the direct sphere of influence of health professionals. We may have opinions on them, we may have information about them, but typically these are areas where there are trade-offs between health and other social policies, and we are not the experts. So these include things like inequality, working conditions, employment, unemployment, various aspects of public policy. I think there are things we can do to address the proximate determinants of health, and as citizens we can advocate about the underlying determinants, but we are not experts on capital gains taxes and why social policies have to face competing ends. So, Anne-Emanuelle gave you some of the stats for Japan and Sweden. So why in the US, where 17 cents on the dollar are spent on health, as compared to the 10 in Japan, probably similar in Sweden, is US life expectancy 79, whereas it's 83 in Japan? Okay, and we know it's related to the fact that Japan and the US are very different societies. Countries with the best health tend to have less social exclusion, more equality of income distribution, and also often less ethnic fractionalization. Japan, Sweden, Costa Rica are all quite unusual compared to many other countries in the world. They are ethnically homogeneous. Japan, in particular, has had a very strong policy discouraging immigration, and the immigrants who get into Japan are typically ethnic Japanese being repatriated from other countries. Okay, whereas, the US is a melting pot. Canada, similarly. Sub-Saharan African countries are very ethnically diverse. At the other extreme, countries with the worst health have wars, refugees, fragile states, ethnic conflict. And those are things that we can think about as health professionals, but we're not necessarily in a position to change. Okay, so likewise, policies can be divided into those that we can do something about, that will affect the proximate determinants of health. There we can advocate and help design policy and help implement policy and reduce risks. But there are equally these underlying determinants that we have much less capability to change. And, Costa Rica, Japan, Sweden are examples of countries that have gone in one direction, and we have countries that have gone in the other, like Russia, where the Gini coefficient is 60, 0.6, one of the highest in the world. And it used to be a lot lower, and it's gone in the opposite direction. There are big differences. We can't expect everybody to follow the path of Sweden and Japan. History does matter, as Anne-Emanuelle pointed out, but countries have started in different places. So I think, in terms of global health, it's important to have appropriate goals. I think global health, as defined as becoming more like Japan and Sweden, or becoming like Japan and Sweden, cannot be achieved. I think countries can aim to do the best possible in terms of promoting health, reducing risk, treating illness, etc. On the other hand, if the backdrop is high unemployment, ethnic fractionalization, levels of income inequality as in the US, it's very difficult to overcome that. So I think I am optimistic about what we can do to achieve global health, but I am also realistic that I know the limits of my knowledge and the limits of my influence, and that's why I feel global health cannot be achieved. Thank you.
So we'll have 4 minutes now of rebuttal from the speakers.
Let me just begin by saying that I think Sue is a bit of a dream killer here. And I say that having been hired by her, actually, to come to the University of Toronto some 11 or 12 years ago. She was the chair of the department and the search committee that hired me. So perhaps some of the ideas that she's expressing are reflective of some of my own skepticism, because I'm often placed on the no side of this debate. But let me take issue with a number of the points that she's made. First of all, the idea that health professionals have very little to contribute to the structural and political determinants of health. I would absolutely disagree. Take Bernardino Ramazzini, who was the founder of occupational health and wrote a fabulous account in 1700 of a range of occupational health diseases that he observed through his patients. So doctors, health professionals on the front lines are absolutely able to contribute to these debates and to reforming policies just by identifying what the structural issues are. Then there's another level, and that is the prestige that physicians and other health professionals hold in many, many societies. And if health professionals are arguing, right, they who supposedly have the expertise around what the determinants of health are, they are arguing, or we all are arguing, that what need to be addressed are these larger structural issues around oppression, distribution of power and resources, then this is an enormous opportunity. As well, folks living in high-income countries actually have a great say over how international financial policy is made, determinants of, for example, foreign direct investment, whether the activities of, for example, Canadian mining companies in West Africa or Latin America can be sued for damaging the environment, attacking activists, and so on in Canadian courts. So we actually have an enormous decision-making capacity around some of these larger structural determinants. But let me just get back again to what countries can do in the situations in which they're located, because Sue mentioned that not every country starts in the same place. So we've certainly seen a deterioration in both life expectancy and equality in the case of the Soviet Union. And this is a breakdown of a very protective welfare state where everybody had a job, everybody had access to education, healthcare, and housing and nutrition and so on. But let's take a counterexample. Brazil, long known as one of the most unequal countries in the world, started out about a decade ago with a Gini coefficient of 0.60, now down to 0.50 through a concerted effort to reduce poverty, to end hunger, to create a national health system accessible to all, and to diminish the concentration of power and resources that had existed in that country for so many years. Now, Brazil has been a big player on the international scene as one of the BRICS. It's also engaged in South-South cooperation, sharing its model of healthcare for all, for example, with many other countries. And so Brazil is seeking not only to focus on its own situation within the country, but also engaging with some of these larger structural factors that affect multiple countries.
Okay, so let me take up the issue of growth versus equity. I mean, this has been for a long period a debate within development economics. So Anne-Emanuelle was going to give you more examples about Cuba and Sri Lanka, and these were the darlings of the growth versus equity debate. These were the countries that set out to achieve equity to start off and have then equitable growth. China and Brazil are the bad guys in this case. They were countries that chose trickle-down, faster growth with the hope that the benefits would then trickle down to the poor. So where are we now? Brazil achieved the fast growth and is now succeeding in improving equity. China is achieving the fast growth and in the future, hopefully, will improve equity. Cuba, not doing so well. And Sri Lanka made great progress, but still nowhere near the leagues of the Chinas. So there are trade-offs. When we think about foreign aid, the DAC committees, the Western countries that report on their aid statistics, have made a huge concerted effort to put more money into the social sector. Okay, I'm going to talk more about that in a second. China has just started to become a major aid donor in its own right, and they are giving aid the way they believe that their own development has occurred. They focus more heavily on economic aid, and they don't give so much aid for the social sectors. Okay, so there are trade-offs. The more money you put into achieving health now, the less money you can put into achieving economic growth now. And in the future, that has consequences for what's going to be available for spending on health. I don't know how many of you here have read or heard of Capital in the 21st Century. Anyone? Okay. There's been a huge empirical literature talking about the growing inequality in income, that countries in France, UK, US have seen this incredible increase in the concentration in wealth and decrease in the ability of people to move across income deciles. But Sweden is a different case. Much greater mobility, much greater equality. What are the policies that are going to change that? Really complicated things on inheritance taxes and capital gains taxes and marginal tax rates. These are not things where the status of being a doctor is going to cut any mustard. This is where it's really important to know about economics, about incentives to generate wealth, about how taxation is going to affect the movements of capital across countries. I think doctors and health professionals have a lot to say about smoking and restaurant nutritional information. and I think the public relies on them much less when they're thinking about globalization and taxation of Amazon. So, sorry to rain on the parade, but hopefully the good fairy can come and counteract the evil fairy's bad wishes here.
Let me begin with the issue just of smoking. Actually, Japanese men have among the highest smoking rates in high-income countries. And so here we have yet another anomaly that distribution within a country, right, can help enormously with. And in fact, Japan has been suffering a recession for some 20 years, and despite that, retains the top life expectancy. So here we have a curious economic phenomenon. Most economists like to talk about the equity economic growth trade-off, but increasing evidence suggests that economic growth actually leads to a rise in inequity once you've reached a certain income level per capita. So once basic needs of a society can be satisfied through a particular economic level, such as sanitation, education, basic services, and so on, then there are these marginal diminishing returns of greater economic growth. And in fact, the very Swedish case and the Japanese case are indicators of that. And so instead we have a very different idea. Perhaps we shouldn't be worried so much about economic growth, but rather to be satisfied within the means that we have. There's a strong movement in the Andean countries called Buen Vivir, an indigenous idea of living within our resources, right? There's a heavy degrowth movement across the Americas and Europe. And so perhaps what we should be doing is paying less attention to economists who worry about growth, and more about societal redistribution. And that's exactly what Cuba's done, and in fact, Cuba's life expectancy is 78, so almost as high as that of the United States and Costa Rica. And in fact, it did very well in dealing with its loss of Soviet subsidies in the 1990s by actually encouraging urban agricultural growth. And so it had a very new model of redistribution within its society and was flexible to change that without growing the economy.
We absolutely are not going to be able to sell a no growth but redistribute now in sub-Saharan Africa. Those countries need more resources, no question. Things like, I'm a big believer in the Millennium Development Goals and the successes that that's brought. And I think we've had a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to make progress. There's been incredible change. Under 5 mortality fell 50%, maternal mortality 22%, newborn mortality 40% over a 23-year period, 1990 to 2013. And over that period, there was an incredible focusing in giving resources and focusing those resources on the low-hanging fruit and improving health outcomes. 10% of foreign aid has gone to health over that period. It's gone up to 27 billion right now annually out of 240 billion. Okay. But there have been issues that we have not succeeded in tackling. We've tackled the low-hanging fruit, but the more expensive items, such as maternal mortality, which requires facility delivery, we have not succeeded yet. So we now have the opportunity with the Sustainable Development Goals to try and move forward. But I'm going to argue, rather pessimistically, we're going to see less success. The Sustainable Development Goals are less focused. There are, 170 targets and 17 goals as opposed to 8 goals, far fewer number of targets. Health has much less priority, and we see foreign assistance from the Western countries slowing down and aid growing from countries like China, which, as I've mentioned, have focused first on growth. And I think if we tell the African countries, you have to put your resources first into health and then let the economy fix itself, they're all going to go to China to try and get assistance, where economic aid has been the priority and health comes later. Thank you.
So if we can just now have closing remarks from each of our speakers for 5 minutes each. And then we will have 2 or 3 minutes for everyone to vote. I encourage you to do so. I've already seen some of the voting, which is interesting already. And then we'll break out into our round tables. So please.
I'm so delighted to hear Sue Horton calling for revolution, especially in the United States. So here, I'm all behind you, Sue. I want to focus on a few issues that we've heard, but only in part. One is that we cannot say to African countries that growth is not important for them when they face so many needs. You know which country had the highest growth rate in the world in 2013? Sierra Leone, 11% growth rate, right? But number 178 on the Human Development Index, and you have to ask a question, right? That an old Colombian poem does. Are we poor because we have no riches, or do we have no riches because we are poor? And in the case of Sierra Leone, I think it's very clear, as with almost every other country in sub-Saharan Africa, that economic growth has come at the price of extreme exploitation, disinvestment in the people, not investment. The rates of capital flight in these enormously resource-rich countries, such as those in West Africa or the Democratic Republic of the Congo, are unfathomable. The fact that there's no taxation to speak of. There are secret deals behind doors. Now, of course, there are local players who are also responsible, but the fact that we have a global economic system that accepts, right, that most of the foreign direct investment in mining, in palm oil, in iron ore, and of course, many of the companies that are investing are listed right here on the Toronto Stock Exchange. Right? So I think we need to be very careful about telling people in sub-Saharan Africa what they should want, what they should need. After all, so many of the problems in those countries, including Sierra Leone, which has the highest infant mortality rate in the world, are from a long-standing colonial legacy which sought to use ethnic division, right, to pit one group against another, and the post-colonial period when efforts such as in the Congo, Patrice Lumumba's Pan-African unity of the country and sovereignty saw him assassinated within just a few months of being the first democratically elected leader. So I think we need to be very cautious in that sense. Now, I just want to end on a hopeful note because these are very heavy issues. Let me reiterate that the enormous strides that have been made in places like Sri Lanka, which despite a very divisive civil war, has been able to build on decades and decades of union struggle, women's early right to vote, education for women and the entire population starting in the 1930s, free public health care starting in the 1950s, and so on, are fantastic models for many other countries to follow. Is it difficult? Absolutely. Right? Does it require persistence? Yes. Does it make us step out of some of our comfort zones, those of us in the health sector? Undoubtedly. Right? But these are within the realm of possibility, and I would argue that instead of being cynical, leaving ourselves to focus on a very narrow approach to what health professionals can do and whether or not global health can be achieved, we should become hopeful realists, calling for equity, ecologically sustainable development, and peace at the heart of a vision for a better world. And here I'm quoting from the People's Health Movement Charter. a world in which a healthy life for all is a reality that respects, appreciates, and celebrates all life and diversity and enables the flowering of people's talents and abilities to enrich each other, a world in which people's voices guide the decisions that shape our lives. There are more than enough resources to achieve this. So if the challenge of modernity is to live without illusions and without becoming disillusioned, as Antonio Gramsci said, let's play on this. Be optimists based on historical data, but be hopeful realists with patience, persistence, and commitment. Thank you.
Okay, so I feel conflicted. When I am with my economics colleagues, because I spent 6 months in the International Institute for Diarrhea Research, people thought, how can I be a credible economist? I must be some unbelievable socialist. On the other hand, Anne-Emanuelle has characterized me here as a cynical and against peace in the world. Luckily, I'm a Gemini. So my role here is, on the one hand, I'm an incredible optimist. That's why I study globalization, economic development, and health. On the other hand, because I have been trained in economics, I have a sincere appreciation of the difficulties that exist and the constraints and the larger issues that we can disagree with, but not as health professionals, we are not particularly empowered to change, although as citizens we can advocate to change them. So there may be more than enough resources to go around, but that's not evident to people who are starving in the sub-Saharan African countries, or who are living in ghettos in New York or in Rio or anywhere else in urban areas across the world. Some of these are inescapable realities. We can do the best we can in the face of those realities. We can advocate for change, but we cannot simply assume away that everyone wants peace and wants equity, and that good feeling is going to change things. So I think we have to be prepared for difficulties and obstacles, but remain optimistic and resolute and do what we can within the constraints. Thank you.